When it comes to HDR time-lapse, one of the first things you need to do is create the high dynamic range images. And this generally involves using a dedicated software tool or a plugin for your favorite image editor. There's a lot of choices out there. You can take a look at HDR effects from the folks at Nix Software, which is now owned by Google. That's one that I often use a lot. Or you could use the built-in toning inside of Photoshop as well. One of my favorite tools, though, that I find myself using more and more is Photomatrix Pro from HDR Soft. And I've got a full comprehensive HDR Soft Photomatrix title here on lynda.com that you can explore to go really deep into the software, but I want to show you some of the essential skills to develop the HDR image, particularly when it comes to batch processing and developing time-lapse images. So let's jump in and start to explore that app. One of the things I have here is I've already organized my images. I've got my raw files ready to go. It's a good idea to do that processing ahead of time, and you can use your Finder or Bridge or Lightroom or really anything to do that. And if we take a look here at the source images, I've pulled together a small subset here. Now, one of the things I find most useful is view these in a grid type view. One of the benefits of looking at a grid is it's easier to see how things break down. Now, in this particular case, it looks like there's 7 exposures in the bracket, so I'll adjust the width of the grid, and sure enough, that's what I have. The base exposure. I was shooting slightly underexposed with exposure compensation here to deal with the backlit subject. Dramatically underexposed image, 6 stops lower here, pulling that down to 7.7 underexposed. And as we go through, pretty straightforward there, adjusting the exposure compensation. So essentially, I have 12 stops of dynamic range here to work with. With 12 stops of information, this is a lot of data, and it's going to be able to show the darkest dark to the brightest highlight. This is a very cool technique, but let's be honest here. I have a lot of data. We're dealing here with each file being about 15 megabytes. These came as raw files off of an Olympus OMD EM1, which I really like for HDR shooting. That's a lot of data. More than 100 megabytes of data per frame before we've processed. So obviously, we need to do a little bit of work with this material before we go too far. All right, I'm going to start by sending the first set of these images over to HDR Soft Photomatrix. So if I'm in Bridge, this is an easy right click, and I could choose to simply open with Photomatrix Pro. And if you've installed this and you're using Lightroom, you'll also find that available as an export module. Now that I've opened this up, I'm going to invoke merging this for tone mapping and fusion. And we'll click OK. The images are all here. I'll click OK to invoke it. And here's a critical thing. Align source images. Normally, when doing an HDR photo, you would choose this option because it's going to look at the image and adjust them subtly for things to line up. The problem is if you're dealing with a time-lapse sequence, this can introduce variety from frame to frame, and it might shift slightly depending upon the auto alignment. Do not use this option if doing a time-lapse sequence. It's critical that you ignore it and you absolutely positively made sure you shot this the right way. You might remember when we were out in the field, I was using my sturdiest tripod. I wanted to make sure that there was minimal vibration or change from frame to frame. This looks good. I will choose to reduce noise and reduce chromatic aberration, which is a problem that's often visible on images that have a lot of backlight. We'll talk more about this a little later. I'll click Merge to HDR and the process begins. You'll see that it converts the raw files in this case, making intermediate files, and it's going to then take those 7 images and merge them together into a single 32-bit file. With the 32-bit image, this is more data than the computer can see. We don't have 32-bit displays. So what needs to happen is that additional information gets tone mapped or fused typically into an 8-bit or a 16-bit file. You use the increase in dynamic range to show more of the highlights and the shadows to add selective contrast, but at the end of the day, you end up going back to an 8-bit or a 16-bit file. But think of it this way. I've got 7 files going in. They're 12-bit files. And with all of those bits of information, it's going to be really easy to take the best parts of each photo to make a really compelling image. All right, you briefly saw the 32-bit image there, and that opened up here into a preview window so I could see what's happening. There are a lot of different categories that you can choose from, and you'll see options here to select different choices. Compare that to the original base photo, and you see that HDR is really doing a nice job. I think it's absolutely lovely how good that sky looks. All the benefits of the clouds, the fact that we shot a longer exposure leads to these really nice tendril type clouds. They're very wispy and coming over the top of the mountains there. The backlight of the sun coming from behind the mountains creates a nice glow around the edge of the mountains. Now, on my short list here are some of my favorites, and you may have different ones, but you could step through these presets just to see what your options are. And if you find something you like, then you can use that as a base point. So, for example, I think this surreal, way too strong, but I'd like to get something kind of intense. So under Painterly here, I like this. The rocks really look fantastic, but I'm going to play with some of my options. For example, I could bring the saturation up a little bit and play with tone compression, which increases the dynamic range between the brightest bright and the darkest dark. And I'm going to adjust contrast there a little. I'll smooth out my highlights so we don't get as much of a glow. Instead of a ringing glow, it's now a softer transition there. But let's lower the white point a little. I could dial in the color temperature that I want, in this case a nice rich blue, and refine the overall black point. Plus, you'll notice there's some different lighting effects to change the way that this looks. In this case, though, I think the medium is the best result. When you find what you want, you're going to want to click the preset menu and choose Save Preset. And that'll make it really easy to access that preset later. You'll note that that has become available in my presets list. Now, you might need to relaunch the application or re-invoke it to see it, but when I saved that preset, it did indeed put it in there. If I check Save Preset and click on Date Modified, you see it's right there. All the other presets that I've created are also available. So here's a handful of some of the ones that I've made for different situations. There's a Detail Enhancer preset. This one's very nice as well with detail enhancing. I think that's bringing a nice job of showing the rocks and the sky. And you can choose what you want here from several different presets that you've made or additional ones that you decide that you want to use. Remember, HDR is just a technique, so you can easily choose from any preset that you've created. Now that you've got the basic preset built, it's time to invoke the batch operation.